Music in the Night by V.C. Andrews. A long time ago, I lived a fairy tale life. There was magic around me, magic in the stars, magic in the ocean, and magic in the sand. At night, when we were only 10 years old, Carrie and I would lie back on blankets on the deck of our daddy's lobster boat, gaze up at the heavens, pretending we were falling into outer space, flying past this planet and that, circling moon, and reaching out to touch the stars. We permitted our minds to wander and imagine. We said anything we wanted to each other, never ashamed or too embarrassed to reveal our most secret thoughts. Our dreams, our intimate questions. We were twins, but Carrie liked to call himself my older brother because, according to Papa, he was born 2 minutes and 29 seconds before me. He behaved like an older brother from the moment he could crawl and protect me. He cried when I was unhappy and he laughed when he heard me laugh, even if he didn't know why I was laughing. When I asked him about that once, he said the sound of my laughter was music to him, and it pleased him so much he couldn't help himself but smile and laugh too. It was as if we were enchanted, who heard our own song, melodies that were sung to us by the sea we loved so much. As far back as I can remember, there was always magic in the water. Carrie could wade in and come walking out with the most spectacular seaweed, starfish, clamshells, seashells, even things he claimed had washed from oceans from other countries to us. When it came to the ocean, I believed anything he said. Sometimes I thought Carrie must have been born with seawater in his veins. No one loved it as much, even when it was nasty and wild. What discoveries Daddy let us keep, we kept either in Carrie's room or mine. We decided everything had some sort of power to it, whether it was the power to grant us a wish or the power to make us healthier or happier just by touching it. We assigned an enchanted quality to each thing we found. When I was 12, I wore a necklace made from tiny seashells we had found. My friends at school were amazed at the way I identified each and every shell, explaining how this one could drive away sadness or that one could make dark clouds move on. They laughed and shook their heads and said Carrie and I were simply foolish and even immature. It was time we grew up and put away childish ideas. There was no magic in these things for them. But to me, there was even magic in the grain of sand. Carrie and I once sat beside each other and let the sand fall through our fingers, pretending each grain was a tiny world unto itself. Inside it lived people like us, too tiny to ever be seen, even with a strong microscope. Be careful where you step, we told our friends when they would come and join us on the beach. You might crush a whole country. They grimaced with confusion, shook their heads and walked on, leaving us behind, enveloped by our own imaginative pictures no one else wanted to share. We were inseparable for so long. I guess people thought we had been born attached. Some of my jealous girlfriends once made up a story about me claiming I had a long scar down the side of my body, from my underarm to my waist. And Carrie had the same scar on his body, and it's where we had supposedly been connected at birth. Sometimes I thought maybe it's true that from the moment we entered the world, our separating had begun, a slow and painful process. It was a separation Carrie fought harder than I did as we grew older. As a very young girl, and even when I first entered my junior high school years, I was comfortable, happy, and grateful for Carrie's devotion to me. Other brothers and sisters I knew argued and occasionally insulted each other, often in public. Carrie never said a really bad thing to me, and he spoke to me in a manner that suggested that he was And if he spoke to me in a manner that suggested he was impatient or annoyed with me, he immediately regretted it afterward. I knew that other girls fixed their flirtation gazes at Carrie and compared with each other for his attention. It wasn't just a sister's prejudice for me to say Carrie was handsome. From the day he could cast a rope or carry a pail, he accompanied Daddy on the lobster boat and helped in the cranberry bog. He always had a dark tan, and that brought out the emeralds in his green eyes. He loved to wear his rich dark hair long, the strands lying softly over the right side of his forehead, just above his eyebrow. It looked so much like silk. Girls were jealous, and all of them longed to run their fingers through it. My brother carried himself firmly with the demeanor of a confident little man, even when he was just in grade school. Other boys used to make fun of the way he held up his head and shoulders, striding alongside with his gaze firmly fixed on where he was headed, his lips tight. Soon, however, they started to envy him, and the girls in our classes just naturally thought of him as older, more mature. Frustrated by their failure to win his attention and interest, however, they eventually found comfort in making fun of us. By the time we were in high school, they were calling Carrie Grandpa. He didn't even seem to care or notice. I was sure it bothered me more than it bothered him. And it wasn't unless someone physically got in his face or insulted me in front of him that Carrie reacted, almost always violently. It didn't matter if the other boy was bigger or even if there were more than one. Carrie's temper was as quick and as devastating as a hurricane. His eyes became glassy and his lips were stretched so tightly they formed white spots in the corners. Anyone who challenged him directly knew they would be in for a fight. Of course, Carrie would get into trouble no matter how justified his reaction was. It was he who had lost his temper, and usually he who dealt the most damage to his opponents. Almost every time he was suspended from school, Daddy gave him a beating and confined him to his room. But nothing Daddy could do and no punishment the school could impose would deter him. He believed if my honor was somehow compromised. With such a devoted and loyal protector watching over me, other boys kept their distance. It wasn't until I entered high school that I realized how untouchable I'd become in their eyes. Many girls my age had crushes on boys or had boyfriends, but no boy dared pass me a note in class, and none joined me in the hallways to walk from one class to another, much less walk me home. I walked with some girlfriends or with Carrie, and if I walked with the girls, Carrie usually followed behind us like my guard dog. When I reached sophomore year, however, I, like most of my girlfriends, wanted a boy who showed serious interest in me. There was a boy named Stephen Daniels who had lived in Providencetown only a year, who I thought was very handsome. I wanted him to talk to me, to walk with me, and even ask me to go out on a date. I thought he wanted to because he was always looking at me, but he never did. All my girlfriends at the time told me he wanted to, but said he wouldn't because of my brother. Stephen was afraid of Carrie. I mentioned it to Carrie, and he said Stephen Daniels was stupid and would go out with any girl if that girl gave him what he wanted. He said that he knew from listening to him in the boys' locker room. Later, I found out Carrie actually walked up to him and put his face an inch from Stephen's, threatening to break his neck if he should so much as look twice at me. Naturally, I was disappointed, but I couldn't help wondering if Carrie had been right. In the evenings after we had done our homework and helped Mommy and May, our younger sister who had been born deaf, with attending a special school for the handicapped, Carrie and I would talk about some of the other kids at school. No matter what girlfriend of mine I mentioned to him, he found fault with her. The only girl he didn't criticize was Teresa Patterson, Roy Patterson's oldest child. Teresa's father, Roy, worked with Daddy on the lobster boat. The Pattersons were bravas, half African American, half Portuguese. The other students looked their noses down on them, especially the ones who came from the so-called blue-blooded families. Families who were able to trace their lineage back to the Pilgrims. Families like Grandma Olivia's, Daddy's mother, who ruled over us like a dogger queen. Carrie liked Teresa and enjoyed being friends with her because he liked the way she and her Brava friends defied the other students. When I asked him if he could ever think of Teresa as his girlfriend, he raised his eyebrows as I had said the silliest thing and replied, "Don't be stupid, Laura. Teresa's like another sister to me." I suppose she was, but as I grew older and felt Carrie's shadow over my shoulder more and more, I began to wish he found some other girl to win his attention. I did my best to recommend this one or that, but nothing I said made him act any differently toward them. If anything, when I mentioned a possible girlfriend for him, that girl suddenly became ugly or stupid in his eyes. I realized it might be better if I just let nature take its course. Only nature didn't. I used to think nature just missed Carrie. She walked by one day while he was out on the lobster boat or something. Other boys his age were trying to get dates, hanging out in town, showing off to get a girl's attention, asking girls to do things with them, but Carrie spent most of his free time with me or his model boats upstairs in the attic workshop, a room just above mine. Finally, one day at lunch, I mentioned my growing concern to Teresa. She rolled her dark eyes and looked at me as if I had just been hatched. "Don't you hear all the talk behind your back? All the whispering and gossip? There isn't a girl in this school who thinks Carrie's normal. And most of the boys have their doubts about you. They don't talk to me about it, but I hear what they say." "What do you mean? What sort of things are they saying about us?" I asked, trembling in anticipation. "They're saying you and your brother are like boyfriend-girlfriend, Laura," she replied hesitantly. My heart skipped a beat, and I remember looking around the cafeteria that day thinking everyone was looking at us, their eyes full of contempt. I shook my head, the deeper realizations taking shape like some dark, ugly beast who had crawled out of a nightmare into my daytime thoughts. "Look at you," Teresa continued. "You're 15 now and one of the prettiest girls in this school. But do you have a boyfriend? No. Anyone asking you for school dances? No. If you go with Carrie." "But there's no buts, Laura. It's because of Carrie," she said. "Because of the way he dotes on you." "I'm sorry," she added. "I really thought you knew and didn't care." "What am I going to do?" I moaned. She nudged me with her shoulder like she usually did when she was about to say something nasty about one of the other girls at school. "Get him a girlfriend who will stir up his hormones. You'll be fine," she said. I remember she got up to join her Brava friends, and I sat there suddenly feeling very alone and unhappy. Carrie came walking into the cafeteria quickly, spotted me, and marched over. "Sorry I'm late," he said. "Mr. Cochran kept me after class about my homework again." "What's going on?" He looked closely at me when I didn't respond. "Did something happen?" I shook my head. I wondered how I could tell him and not hurt him. I put it off and never really tried to make him understand until the year after, when Robert Royce and his family bought the old C. Mariana Hotel and Robert entered school. For me and Robert, it was love at first sight, and that brought with it a special kind of magic Carrie couldn't share. Somehow, I had to make him understand and accept. I had to show him how to separate himself from me. I only hoped it was possible. Chapter 1. Young Love. All day my heart had been beating faster than normal, thumping so hard I was sure Carrie heard the echo in my chest. When I walked, it was as if my feet didn't touch the ground. I was floating along on a cloud of air, bouncing with the spring in my step. I was positive I had woken this morning with a smile on my face, and sure enough, when I looked at myself in the vanity table mirror, I saw my cheeks were flushed with excitement. The excitement of wonderful dreams that continued into my waking moments. Dreams that carried me on a magical carpet, like some Arabian princess floating through the volumes and volumes of enchantment. Everything around me looked and took on a new and different glow. Colors I had grown to use were brighter, richer, sharper. Every normal sound became part of a grand symphony, whether it was simply the creak in the stairs as I descended to help Mommy with breakfast, or the clink of dish pans, or the splash of water running in the sink, the opening and closing of the refrigerator, Carrie's steps in the hallway. Their voices suddenly became a choir behind the music. "You look very nice today, dear," Mommy said at breakfast. Daddy glanced at me and nodded. I held my breath because I was wearing just a touch of lipstick, and Daddy hated makeup on a woman. He said that it was the devil's touch, and an honest woman never tried to fool a man by using paint on her face. I had chosen my brightest blue dress with the white collar. I wore my gold charm bracelet, the one Mommy and Daddy had recently given me on my 16th birthday. They had given Carrie an expensive pocket watch on a gold chain that played "Onward Christian Soldiers" when he flipped it open. Carrie looked up from his bowl of oatmeal. "Aren't you afraid you'll swallow some of that lipstick?" he asked, sending a bolt of ominous lightning through the morning warm sunshine. I looked at Daddy, but he just snapped the newspaper and glanced at the headlines. Then I threw Carrie my most angry look, and he went back to his oatmeal. When we stepped outside to start for school, I stopped in the doorway and felt the sunshine on my face and closed my eyes. I embraced my books against my breast, wishing that none of this was a dream. "What are you doing?" Carrie asked sharply. "You want May to be late for school?" "I'm sorry," I said, skipping forward to join them. He held May's hand firmly into his own. My little sister looked in her silence, gazed up with me, and had twinkles in her eyes, as if she knew it all, as if she poked her pretty little face into one of my dreams last night and saw my happiness. I took her other hand and we continued down the street. I felt like Alice in Wonderland. "You're behaving just like all the other dumb girls at our school," Carrie muttered and threw me a look of reprimand. "Making a fool of yourself over some boy." I only smiled back at him. Today, I thought, today I am surrounded by protective, tiny, fairy-like creatures who would deflect any arrows of unhappiness away from me. There were clouds in the sky, but to me it was all blue. Although it was early May, there was still a chill in the air, a residue of yesterday's nor'easter. The white caps sprouted on the surface of the sea like water lilies, and even this far away from the shore, we could hear the surf roaring in. In the sunlight, the sand was the color of autumn gold. The terns looked like they were tiptoeing over uncovered treasure as they searched their morning meal. My hair was pinned back, but some loose strands whipped gently at my forehead and cheeks. May wore her light blue headband that kept her hair neatly in place. Carrie couldn't care less about what his hair looked like when he entered school. He would just run his fingers through it and not even go to the boys' room like all the other young men to brush or comb in front of the mirrors. Instead, he would accompany me to my locker and wait until I had my books before going to get his own. He would stand there even when Robert Royce joined me, and he would glare unhappily, suspiciously, hardly talking, lingering aside, or just behind us like an angry storm cloud. It was the only thing that put darkness in my heart these days. "Stop daydreaming and watch where you're walking," Carrie ordered as the car sped past us. The invasion of tourists had begun in small ways. The entire Cape was busier now on the weekends, but traffic during the week was still lazy down Commercial Street. Our route this morning took us to the side streets of May's school. At the gate, we kissed her and signed our goodbyes, Carrie putting on his best daddy-like face to warn her to behave herself, and as if she needed a warning. There was no one sweeter, no one more gentle and fragile and loving than May. Although Dr. Nolan assured us her deafness had nothing to do with it, May's growth was impeded. She was bright and intelligent, always doing well in school, but she was so tiny for her age. Her facial features as diminutive as a doll's, her hands so small that they barely covered Carrie's or my palms when we held them. All of us protected and loved her dearly, but sometimes I would catch Daddy gazing at her, unaware that anyone was looking at him, and I would see the most terrible expression of sadness on his face. His eyes glazed with trapped tears, his lower lip trembling just enough to be noticed. Then he would become aware of what he was doing, and he would snap into a firm posture, wiping away any emotion from his face. I never saw Daddy really cry. The only times I saw him with his head down was when we were praying or after a particularly hard day of fishing. After school, May turned back after she started through the gate and smiled at me impishly as she signed. "Don't kiss Robert too much," she giggled and ran into the building with the other children. I glanced at Carrie, but he pretended not to have seen her and started off. His steps so deliberate, I thought he would leave footprints in the walk. It was Friday, and tonight was the school spring dance. For the first time in my life, I would have a real date for a school party. Robert Royce had asked me. It was to be our first formal date. Up until now, we had just met in places by accident or after we had timidly suggested to each other we might be someplace at a given time. Robert had enrolled at our school in late February. His parents had purchased the C. Mariana Hotel that had 50 rooms on the northwest end of town. As soon as spring came, they began the restoration of the old resort, repairing, painting, and pruning the landscape. Robert was an only child, so there was no other children to help Charles and Jane Royce. Robert complained that his family had put most of their money into the purchase of the property and they had to do most of the work themselves. Because of that, he went home directly after school and was busy on the weekends, especially now that the summer season was approaching. I had hoped Carrie would find Robert's devotion to his family and their business admirable. He and Robert really had a lot in common. But from the moment Robert had the courage to step up to me in the hallway and begin conversation right in front of Carrie, Carrie's eyes grew small and dark whenever Robert was around. Robert always tried to include him in our conversation, but Carrie's responses were short, sometimes not much more than a grunt or a shrug. I was afraid Robert would either frighten away or bothered so much by Carrie's behavior that he would stop speaking to me and walking with me. But instead he grew bolder and even took a break from working on the hotel and visited me at home one Saturday. Carrie had gone to the dock to work on the lobster boat engine with Daddy and Roy Patterson. I introduced Robert to Mommy and May fell in love with him faster than I had. Robert was good at picking up signing too. Before he left that day, he learned how to say hello and goodbye, and I'm very, very hungry. Later, when Carrie returned and Mommy told him and Daddy that I had company, Carrie turned white and then bright red and asked me why I hadn't brought him down to the dock. I didn't want to interrupt you, I exclaimed. Actually, I was grateful for the privacy, for not having Carrie hovering over us. He looked hurt and then angry. Ashamed of what to do, he asked. Of course not, I protested. And besides, you've spoken to Robert, and you know he's not like that. He doesn't come from a snobby family, Carrie. If anyone has a snobby family, it's ours. Carrie grunted, reluctant to admit I was right. He probably knew I was down at the dock all day, he muttered. What? Why would that matter, Carrie? It matters, he said. Believe me, all these guys take advantage, Laura. You're just too trusting. It's why I have to look out for you, he declared. No, you don't. Not with Robert. And I'm not too trusting, Carrie Logan. You don't know everything there is to know about me, and you certainly know nothing about romance, I flared and stomped up to my room, closing the door behind me. After my heart stopped pounding, I grew calm. I lay back and thought about my wonderful afternoon with Robert. Waking up, walking on the beach, holding his hand, just talking. We told each other about ourselves, our favorite foods, colors, and books. He was surprised that we didn't have a television set, but he refused to criticize Daddy when he learned it was Daddy's decision. Your father's probably right, he said. You do read more than anyone I know, and you're a great student. He smiled that sort of smile that embeds itself in your mind, prints itself on the surface of your memory. He had azure blue eyes that turned opaque whenever he spoke deeply or serious to me. But when he smiled, his eyes brightened, and it's as if they'd drawn sunshine into them. It was the sort of smile that warmed your heart, infectious, sweeping away any cobwebs of gloom. Robert was about an inch taller than Carrie, and just as broad-shouldered. He had longer arms, but was not as muscular. He wore his light brown hair short and always neatly brushed at the sides with just a slight wave in the front. Because he was a year older and a senior, we didn't have any classes together, but I knew he was a good student and the teachers liked him because he was polite and inquisitive. Carrie had never been a good student. He wore school like a pair of pants 2 sizes too small, reluctant to get in, struggling to be comfortable, relieved when the end of the day bell would ring. He hated being shut up and regimented by the clock and rules. He was truly a fish out of water. Consequently, Robert Royce's success in school was another thing Carrie resented. He hated whenever Robert and I got into a discussion about history or a book we'd read for class. To Carrie, it was as if we had begun to sneak and speak in a different language. On a few occasions, however, Robert did try to talk about his family problems with the hotel construction difficulties, the use of tools and paints, things Carrie understood and appreciated. Almost as reluctant as someone sitting in a dentist chair, Carrie would settle into the conversation, offering his suggestions as dryly and quickly as he could. Later, Carrie would tell me Robert should stick his quizzes in history and leave the real work to men who are more qualified. That only brought a smile to my face and a look of confusion in Carrie's. "What?" he demanded. "What's so funny, Laura? I swear, you walk around with that stupid grin on your face all the time these days. You just don't know how silly you look." "You simply can't admit that you like him, can you, Carrie?" I said, and he reddened. "I don't," he insisted. "There's nothing to admit." Despite this gloomy prognosis, I hoped and prayed Carrie would eventually become friends with Robert, especially after he'd asked me to the school dance. Mommy really liked Robert, but Daddy hadn't met him yet, and I knew he wouldn't give me permission to go to the dance with him until he had. So, the Saturday after he had asked me, I invited him to the house for lunch. Robert charmed Mommy again by bringing her a box of candy. Carrie called it a bribe, but I patiently explained it was only a polite gesture. Something people invited to lunch or dinner often do. As usual, he grunted and turned away rather than to admit I might be right. At lunch, Robert sat beside me and across from Carrie, who kept his eyes down and refused to talk. We began our meal as usual with the reading from the Bible. I had to warn Robert that was something Daddy always did. Daddy paused when he opened the holy book and gazed at Robert. "Perhaps our guest has a suggestion," he said. Carrie started to smile. It was Daddy's little test. He was always lecturing us that young people were slipping into sin faster because they didn't know their Bible. Robert thought a moment and said, "I like Matthew chapter 7. Daddy raised his eyebrows. He glanced at Carrie, who suddenly looked glum. "You know that one, Carrie?" Daddy asked. Carrie was silent, and then Daddy's handed Robert the Bible. Robert opened it, smiled at me, then glanced at Carrie before beginning in a soft, silky voice. "Judge not, that ye not be judged. For with that judgment ye shall be judged." He read on and then looked up at Daddy. "Good," he said. "Good words to remember." "Yes, sir, they are," Robert said, and Daddy and he began a conversation about the tourist business, the old sea marina, and how Daddy remembered it. I was afraid Daddy would take off on one of his and Grandma Olivia's favorite pet peeve, how the tourists are ruining the Cape, but he was civil and said nothing critical. Carrie sulked with his back against the chair, only speaking when he wanted someone to pass him a dish. Robert confessed that he knew little about the lobster business and even less about sea and boats. "We've been so busy fixing the place, I haven't had much time for anything else," he explained. "That's all right. Your parents need you first. Maybe after lunch you can go down to the dock and see our rig," Daddy said, looking at Carrie. But after lunch, Carrie claimed that he had to go work on one of his models and had spent enough time on the boat that week anyway. I took May's hand and Robert took the other, the way Carrie always did. The three of us followed Daddy down to the dock. I turned and looked back at the house, and I thought I saw Carrie looking from the upstairs window. For a moment I felt like bursting into tears, but Robert's smile drove the feeling away quickly, and we continued on. Most important, Daddy's approval of Robert that day. And so tonight I would be attending the school dance with my very first boyfriend. The school was buzzing like a beehive all day long. Everyone was fidgety in their seat in class, and the cafeteria sounded like 100 more students had enrolled that morning. Only Carrie moved like a somber mourner through the halls, his face gray, his eyes dark. He sat silently, eating mechanically in the cafeteria. "Why don't you ask Millie Stargill to the dance tonight, Carrie?" I suggested when Robert and I sat down next to him. "I know no one has asked her yet." Carrie stopped chewing and looked at me with such pain in his eyes. I got a lump in my throat and I couldn't swallow for a moment. "Millie Stargill?" He laughed. It was a wild, loud, and frightening laugh. "Whose idea was that? His?" he said, nodding at Robert. "No, I just thought..." "She's a pretty girl," Robert said. "I bet she'd love to go." "So why don't you ask her?" Carrie retorted. Robert smiled softly and gazed at me. "I've already got a date," he said. "Then why are you looking at other girls?" Carrie shot back at him. "I'm not. I was only saying..." "See, I warned you," Carrie said to me and got up. "These dances are stupid anyway," he said. "Hanging out in the school gym is not my idea of fun. If I go on a date, I'm not going to bring her back to this place." "Carrie," I called as he started away. He just glared back and continued out of the cafeteria. "He'll be all right," Robert said, and put his hand over mine. "One day he'll meet someone and his heart will pound just like mine did when I first looked at you." I nodded, but I didn't have as much confidence in something like that happening to Carrie anytime soon. Not for a moment. And I knew that until Carrie was happy, I would have a very hard time being happy myself. It seemed to me Carrie deliberately walked a great deal slower than usual when we left school. He didn't have to be a genius to see how eager I was to get back home. "May will be waiting for us," I complained. "I'm not waiting for you to catch up," I added. "So go on by yourself," he said, and I hurried away. May was actually just coming out of her school when I arrived. I signed for her to hurry up. Carrie was so far behind he was out of sight of May's school. May asked where he was, and I told her that he's being a brat. She looked back confused, but she didn't slow down. She knew why I was hurrying home, and she was almost as excited as I was. When we got to our home, she started to ask if she could help me get ready for the dance, and I signed back that I would need all her help I could get. May laughed and signed that she thought I was already beautiful, so I wouldn't be needing much help at all. Despite May's words of encouragement, I wanted to do something special with my hair. I'd shown Mommy a picture of a girl in 17 and told her that I wanted to style my hair that way. She said she would help. She was almost as good as a regular beautician. So after I showered and washed my hair, I sat at my vanity table and Mommy began to brush my hair and trim it. May sat on the stool beside me and watched, her eyes full of excitement. She was full of questions. Why, she wanted to know, did I have to change the way my hair looked? "This is a special occasion," I told her. "I wanted to try to look as good as I can." "Oh, you'll be beautiful, Laura," Mommy said. "You're the prettiest girl in school." "Oh, Mommy, you are. Carrie says so." "He's prejudiced," I said. "I remember there was a girl named Elaine Whitting when I was in school. She was so pretty that everyone thought she'd become a movie star. All the boys tried so hard to be the first she'd ask to the school dance. I never saw her without every hair being in place, and there wasn't a boy whose head didn't spin when she walked by." "I bet it's the same for you," Mommy said, with a wonderfully happy smile on her face. She was looking at me in the mirror, but her eyes seemed to be focused on her own fantasy. I couldn't tell that Neither she nor Daddy had ever heard a nasty whisper about me or Carrie. It would just break her heart if she knew what some of the students at school thought. Ugly rumors could be like infectious diseases, corrupting, rotting, and sickening even the most healthy souls. Which boys did you go to dances with, Mommy? I asked her. Oh, no one ever asked me. I was what you would call a wallflower, she said with a smile. I'm sure you weren't, Mommy. I was frightfully shy, especially around boys. I was glad when my father and Samuel planned my marriage to your father. What? Your marriage was arranged? Well, I guess you could call it that. Though, really, it wasn't as bad as it sounds. Our fathers discussed it, and I guess Grandpa Samuel told your father, and he decided I would do, and we began to take interest in me. She paused and laughed at the memory. What? I was just remembering the first time your father spoke to me. I was coming home from work at the pharmacy, and he slowed down his truck and asked if I wanted to go for a ride. I knew who he was. Everyone knew about who the Logans were. Anyway, I didn't reply. I kept walking, afraid to even turn my head toward him. He drove ahead and then stopped and waited until I reached him, and he leaned out and asked me again. I shook my head without speaking and kept walking. Then what? I asked. Breath bated. He drove off, and I thought that was the end of it. But when I turned the corner and started down the street towards my home, there he was. He parked his truck and was leaning against the door waiting for me. I tell you, I was terrified, she admitted, and then glanced at May, who was tilting her head, wondering what Mommy was talking about for so long. I almost turned around and went the other way, but I kept walking. And when I reached him, he stood up and said, I'm glad you didn't accept my offer out of hand, Sarah. Shows that you're not a frivolous young lady. Your father and mine have been talking about how we would make a good couple. I'd like the permission to come calling on you next Saturday properly. Well, that just took my breath away, she said. You see, I had no idea of my father's plan up until then. I didn't even know he and Samuel Logan were friends. Well, once I recovered, your father asked, do I have your permission? And I nodded. Thank you, he said, and drove off, leaving me standing there with the most befuddled look on my face, I'm sure. Did he come calling for you the next Saturday? He did, and then we began to go out on dates. Our fathers discussed our marriage, but Jacob didn't bring me up to see Olivia for some time. She wasn't exactly demanding he bring me up to the house, she added. Why not? I think Olivia Logan had someone else in mind for your father, someone more wealthy, someone with social position, she said. But Grandpa Samuel had gone ahead and discussed it with my father, and Jacob took liking to me, so that was that. No matter, she said with a small wave of her hand. That's the past now. Let's get back to your hair, she said excitedly. Did you have a nice wedding, Mommy? I added, not ready to give up on her first glimpse. It was a simple wedding at Olivia and Samuel's home. Judge Childs married us. I never heard you talk about your honeymoon, Mommy. That's because I didn't have one. You didn't? Not really. Your father had to go back to work the next day, and we told ourselves we'd take vacation soon But we didn't. Life, she said with a sigh. Life just takes over. Before I knew it, I was pregnant with you and Carrie. Don't look so sad, Laura, she said, gazing at me in the mirror. I'm not unhappy. I know you're not, Mommy, but I just wish you could have a chance to travel and to do something fun. No one except Uncle Chester and Aunt Haley. I just wish you had a chance to travel. No one has left except Uncle Chester and Aunt Haley. Mommy, I never understood why Daddy stopped talking to Uncle Chester and why Uncle Chester and Aunt Haley left Providencetown, I said. You know your father doesn't want us talking about them, Laura. I know, but this is such a happy time. Please, dear, she begged. She closed her eyes, then opened them again, as she often did when she wanted to just forget or skip over something unpleasant. I didn't want to make her uncomfortable, but Uncle Chester and Aunt Haley remained a big mystery in our family. And I just naturally wondered what had complicated their love affair to make them outcasts. Okay, Mommy, I said, and she looked grateful. I smiled and turned to May. While I was signing, I heard a creak in the floorboards above and realized Carrie was in the attic working. I glanced up at the ceiling, thinking about him. Suddenly, I saw what looked like a tiny pinhole of light in my ceiling. My breath caught, and I brought my hand to my chest. What's wrong, dear? Mommy said. What? Nothing, I said. That looks fine, Mommy. I better lay my clothes out now, I said quickly. She stepped back and nodded. I glanced up at the ceiling again. The light was gone, as if someone had covered the hole. Why hadn't I ever noticed it before, I wondered. My fingers trembled as I sifted through my closet to find my most beautiful dress. The pink taffeta Mommy had made for me. It was the only formal dress I owned. It was a good dancing dress, too. All week I had been practiced dancing. May sat on the bed and watched. Now I thought about that hole in the ceiling and wondered if Carrie had been watching us all that time. Did he feel left out? Was that why he would do that? How long had that hole been there? Are you happy with the dress, Laura? Mommy asked. I know it's not expensive, as the other girls are wearing. What? Oh yes, Mommy, I just love this dress. Well, Mommy said I better get downstairs and work on dinner. Call me when you're ready, she said. I started to shake my head. Mommy's necklace was her only really expensive piece of jewelry. Even her wedding ring was not that expensive because Daddy thought it was a waste of money to be elaborate on those kinds of things. When Mommy gave me this necklace, I told her I can't. Sure you can, honey. When do I get the chance to wear it? I want you to wear it for me, okay? I nodded hesitantly. Come along, May, she signed. Mommy, thank you. She held out her arms and I hugged her. I felt tears prickling under my lids and quickly kissed her on the cheek. After she and May left, I sat at my vanity table and began to paint my fingernails. I started to daydream, imagining what it would be like under all the balloons and the lights. A deep creak in the ceiling pulled me out of my reverie and reminded me of the peephole in my ceiling. I gazed up, and then I got up and went to the bathroom. I was angry, but I began to feel sorry for Carrie. I knew I was shutting him out as a part of my life. I was growing up. The things that once amused me, that amused us, were no longer enough. He'll soon realize it. I convinced myself he has to. In the meantime, I don't want to do anything else to break his heart. My thoughts returned to the dance. I was excited. I hurried to put on my dress, and I put on a little bit more lipstick. I perfected my hair before taking a deep breath and gazing at myself in the mirror. Everyone was just finishing dinner when I went downstairs. Mommy slapped her hands together and cried out as soon as I entered the dining room. Daddy sat back nodding. May was smiling ear to ear, and Carrie wore a strange dark look. "You're beautiful, honey, just beautiful. Isn't she, Jacob?" Mommy said. "Vanity is a sin, Sarah. She looks fine, but there's no reason to blow her so full of steam she explodes." Daddy chastised. However, he wore a very proud expression as well. "Now you just wait right there," Mommy said, and she hurried out of the dining room. "How do I look, Carrie?" I asked him. I couldn't stand the fact that he wouldn't look my way. "Fine," he said quickly and dropped his gaze to the plate. "I might have thought you'd be going to the dance too," Daddy told him. "It's stupid," Carrie muttered. "How's that?" "I'm not interested in an old dance," he snapped. Daddy's eyebrows lifted. "Well, it's chaperoned affair, isn't it? Teachers are there, right?" "What's the matter, Dad?" Carrie said with a smirk. "Teachers are in school too, but kids smoke in the bathroom and do other things." "What other things?" "Other things," Carrie said, realizing he was digging himself into a hole he might not easily climb out of. He looked at me, but I said nothing. "Dumb things kids do." "Laura's a good girl," Daddy said, looking at me. "She wouldn't do anything to embarrass this family." Carrie smirked and looked away. "Of course I won't, Daddy," I said, my eyes fixed on Carrie. Mommy returned with her necklace in hand. "I wanted her to wear this tonight, Jacob," she said. "Doesn't it look nice on her?" "Be careful with that," Daddy warned. "I will. Thank you, Mommy." We heard the doorbell. "That'll be Robert," I said. He looked terribly handsome in his jacket and tie. He was carrying a small box in his hand. "It's a corsage," he declared. "Oh, that's very thoughtful," Mommy said. Robert signed hello to May, who beamed beside me. Then he opened the box and took out the corsage of red roses, my favorite. They matched the garnets perfectly. "You'll have to pin it on," I told him. He looked at Mommy, helpless for a moment, and then he tried, but his fingers were clumsy with his nervousness. "I'll do it," Mommy said, coming over to our rescue. Robert smiled with relief and stepped back and watched her pin it on me. "There, that's very pretty," Mommy said. "Thanks." "We should get going," Robert said. "Don't want to miss the opening dance." "Have a wonderful time," Mommy said. Daddy came up behind her and looked at Robert. "You look fine, boy," he said. "Now remember," he added with a scowl, "I want her home before midnight." "Yes, sir," Robert said. I looked for Carrie, but he didn't come out of the dining room. "Good night, Carrie," I called. There was no response, and I flashed a weak smile at Mommy, who nodded with her face full of light, her eyes brighter than ever, and Robert and I stepped out into the night. He opened the car door for me, and I got in. "Laura, you look more beautiful than I ever dreamed." "Thanks, Robert. You're handsome yourself." As we backed up, I looked toward the front door, half expecting to see Carrie, but he wasn't anywhere to be seen.